Hello and welcome back to part 4 of a 10-part series GNAT-TV and other community access centers across the Vermont Access Network are hosting in partnership with the Vermont Council on Rural Development and the Barre Times Argus and Rutland Herald newspapers. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. This 10-part series is about ideas for the future of Vermont and looks at what are some of the big questions that are facing the state as we emerge out of the pandemic and into whatever lies ahead. What are some of the big issues that will be facing the state in coming years, and how will we go about tackling them? Upcoming topics in our series will include such areas as education, childcare, business development, civic engagement, and several others. So far, we've talked about broadband development, welcoming new Vermonters, climate change and its relationship to the state's economy. And if you missed one, if you want to get caught up on some of the previous discussions, you can visit the futureofvermont.org/explore website. And you can find not only our previous telecasts, but the written opinion pieces that have accompanied the series that have been published in the Herald and the Times Argus, as well as the podcast versions of the shows in case you just rather listen. So today, our topic is about economic disparities and economic opportunity. The fourth proposition reads as follows: Vermont must reduce economic disparity, advance economic opportunity, and rebuild the middle class. With us today to discuss this point are Paul Costello, who is the Executive Director of the Vermont Council on Rural Development. Dan Smith is the President and CEO of the Vermont Community Foundation. And Maura Collins is the Executive Director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. In a moment, I'd like both Maura and Dan to describe the work their organizations do. But first, Paul, I was wondering if you could help us get started here and summarize or give an overview of the process you and the Vermont Council on Rural Development went through to assemble these propositions and where they're all going to lead.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It's great to be here with you and Dan and Maura. The Council on Rural Development is a listening organization charged by the Farm Bill to bring people together, look at what can help unite us in collective action at the community level and at the state level. And over the last couple of years, we've been looking hard at the big pictures that are confronting rural communities. The loss of youth, economic stagnation in certain parts of the state, the crucial importance of the national dialogue on race and how we move forward as a whole people in this country, which also is a big issue here in Vermont. The fact of COVID and the troubles of COVID and the recovery effort around COVID, and how we've learned from COVID around science to look rationally straight in the face of issues that confront us, like climate change, and be prepared. So we've rolled a lot of dialogue with a lot of people together in thinking about what Vermont needs to do to recover and not just go back to the conditions that we've lived in, but think forward around the next 20, 30 years of Vermont. And we followed the Community Foundation. So it's great to have Dan here, who a couple of years ago held their annual meeting to ask Vermonters, what do we need to do in the next 3 years to make Vermont a successful place by 2050? We've been asking literally thousands of people that question over the last few months. Maura and I worked closely on the local solutions part of the governor's recovery task force. We interviewed people in lots of different settings, but had about 1,200 people engaged on county level calls. VCRD has subsequently interviewed probably 100 people and done group interviews with 30 or 40 different groups, as well as had over 1,000 people review the ideas that are on the list of the 10 propositions, rewrite them, send in their own propositions. And we've got a stack about 400 pages high of people's input that we're working to digest before the summit process on the 26th and 27th of May. So the economic disparity issue is fundamental to Vermont. We, like the rest of this country, see a greater divide between people with wealth and people living in poverty. We see intergenerational poverty that has paralyzed some families. We see a fundamental challenge for the future of democracy in terms of how we participate together as equals in a society when these conditions are so long-standing. And we think that as we look to the renewal of Vermont for the 21st century, this is an issue that we need to look at head on. So deeply appreciate you leading the show today, Andrew, for us to have a chance to talk about it.
Thank you, Paul. My pleasure. Well, Maura, Dan, let's have you describe your organizations a little bit here. What are some of your missions and what do you do? And Maura, perhaps we'll let you get us started.
Yes, the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, VHFA, has been around since the mid-70s, and it's a statewide nonprofit housing lender. So our mission is to both finance and promote affordable, safe, and decent housing opportunities for low and moderate income Vermonters. So we're really focused on those low and moderate income Vermonters that make up a majority of us. And so with that, we offer mortgages to mostly first-time home buyers and give them the opportunity to move into home ownership in homes across the state. And then also we give large loans and tax credits to developers of affordable rental housing. And so we're in many ways a back office bank. A lot of people don't come to us directly, but we work through participating lenders, through nonprofit developers, through others to reach our mission and to serve the state.
Okay, and Dan?
Great. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's nice to see you, Paul, Maura, and Andrew. Thanks for hosting us. The Vermont Community Foundation, our vision is Vermont that's at its best and Vermonters at their best. And we pursue that vision through a mission of bringing people and resources together to make a difference in Vermont. We support Vermont-focused philanthropists with a variety of charitable advised funds and charitable fund products, helping them find and fund the causes they love and the place they care about. We support communities with grants and investment capital. And we offer leadership and research and insight around the kinds of tactics, tools, and strategies that are going to help communities make progress on the systemic challenges we face in the state. In the last few years, we've been focused, as Paul described, on some of the long-term systems that have really kept, held people in place, particularly economically, and the systems whose lack of functionality has really created disparate experience over time between generations and across regions. And I look forward to this discussion because I think it's an important one for Vermont in the long term.
All right. Well, maybe we should begin by kind of just sort of setting the terms of the conversation in a way. And guess I'd be curious to hear from both of you. How severe is the economic disparity in Vermont? I mean, are we about the same as just about anywhere else in the country, or are we in somewhat better shape or worse shape, as best you can tell?
I think so. I'll jump in on that, Andrew, if I could, because
Sure.
To me, it's less a question of relativity, and you could find benchmarks that say we're more severe than other places, or less severe than other places, or less severe than the national average. The key question really is, whether when it comes to economic disparity and almost any other disparity, is it dramatic enough that people's sense of common experience is no longer present? Do people understand the way they live and exist in a community together in a common way, or is it just fundamentally different? And I would say in Vermont, based on a number of different data sets, we feel like all indications are that sense of common experience, the sense of hope and potential and economic opportunity that exists in place has been eroding, and it has been eroding for a period of decades. And that has both civic and social and economic implications for all of our communities that bear addressing.
Andrew, if I could, the Vermont Public Radio did a survey a couple of years ago that Dan's also referenced in different public meetings, where they asked Vermonters, if your family had an unexpected $1,000 expense, would it put your family in a crisis? And 40% of Vermont families said yes.
Yeah.
So you think about how close to the wire people are, and how the level of worry that you have, and how everything becomes an emergency when you're living so close to the bone. beyond the fact that you struggle to meet regular household expenses. But that's just a really serious indicator of how challenged so many people in Vermont are.
There was a bunch of other data. I'm glad you brought up that survey because it predated the pandemic, which we all know, frankly, accelerated so many of these circumstances in the last year. But the other piece of insight that came out of that survey that I always found incredibly telling was that more than half of Vermonters, when asked whether they would advise a young person to pursue their future in Vermont, more than half of Vermonters said they would advise that young person to leave the state to pursue their future. And that, in terms of how we feel about whether or not there is a vibrant future in this place, that's a key data point. But then you think about the cost it takes to leave, right? And the fact that 40% of families don't have $1,000, they couldn't afford to. Think about how people show up in place and what we're asking of people civically or economically. If you don't have $1,000 in your savings account and you feel like you have a better future elsewhere, people who are trapped in place and trapped by circumstance, we have to work really hard to stitch back together that sense of common experience in a way to have a strong structural and civic environment.
And I think that all this has been exacerbated by the pandemic, but it existed, as we keep saying, far before the pandemic. That was one of the most surprising findings of the governor's task force that Paul and I served on, surveying these thousands of Vermonters and asking, and this survey was, May, June of 2020. And so it was when it felt like we were in the height of the nervousness, the fear of what was happening. And yet the responses we got about what was needed by Vermonters and by the supporting organizations that serve Vermonters were the same messages that we have been hearing for years. And of course, I'm focused on the housing messages and affordability, but concerns about broadband, concerns about food security, childcare, healthcare. These were not new messages to our state. And so they just had a spotlight shined on them as a result of the pandemic. But really getting to the crux of what's behind this is critical if we're ever going to change the conversation and have that more stable fabric that Dan's speaking about that we can offer to Vermonters for them to rely on.
Yeah, part of the elephant in the room, and I almost hate to bring this up, but my background is in history. I have a PhD in intellectual history, and I look at long-term patterns of history as what I've written about in the past. And I had a friend who was a very conservative person who said to me one day something that really startled me. He said, when you look at world civilizations and the history of democracy, and you look at democracies, you don't see democracy survive when economic disparities reach a certain pitch. And he said, our society right now, and this is not Bernie Sanders, this is a conservative Republican telling me that our society has the greatest economic disparity in world history for a living democracy. And we're going to need to look at that really fundamentally if we're going to be survive successfully in the Republican form of government. And I'm saying that as something I heard, but we all know what happened on January 6th and how the breakdown of different groups of people within our country, it's not just ideological, it's who's participating, who feels like they have ownership in our society and who doesn't. And the disparities in wealth are sort of an indicator and a foundation, but it kind of gets back to what Dan was using, the word of that connection and commitment to each other within a democratic society and civility, which comes from a sense of mutual ownership and participation. And that can break down. In Vermont, we look at, sometimes people talk about two Vermonts, and we can talk about that a little bit, but it's a huge issue for us in Vermont, but also for our country, obviously.
If I could just riff on that a little bit, Andrew, there's a national data around people's prospects. People who were born in 1945 had a better than 90% chance of doing better than their parents did economically over the course of their lives. If you've been born since 1980, you have a 50-50 chance of doing better than your parents economically over your life. And so, it bears questioning, how confident you are in the systems and the civic structure that has created essentially a toss-up for your kids or for your kid. When it's a toss-up, it's there's a lot of work to do civically around those systems to keep you engaged and to keep your stake in that system. Now, you asked earlier, whether Vermont's economic disparities were an outlier relative to the national circumstance. And I would say there are a couple indicators where, we're either a regional or a national outlier that are worth focusing on. We have the highest poverty rate among 18 to 34-year-olds in New England. It used to be by 6 percentage points, but Maine's catching up to us, unfortunately. And that's well above the national average for poverty. So there's a high poverty rate among young professionals, people hitting the workforce. We have a high school graduation rate, but we have a relatively low college continuation rate. We know that in the 21st century, and we know that in Vermont, all of the growing jobs that actually pay more than $21 an hour require some education after high school. And so young people who most stand to benefit from accessing those jobs are actually least likely to continue the education that's necessary. We also have incredibly challenging circumstances, and this is why Maura's work and VHFA's work is so important, and why the VCF has a mission investment in VHFA. We have incredibly challenging costs of home acquisition. And when you look at the legs and the building blocks for closing the gaps of economic disparity, like post-secondary education, access to home ownership, and the wealth accrual and the savings accrual that occurs through home equity. And then entrepreneurship is really the third one. And so, we have work to do in all three of these areas to create a vibrant set of circumstances that allow people to be economically secure enough to see a sense of potential that'll retain the vibrance that we have come to appreciate about our community.
I wanted to sort of explore a little bit about that point about how we got here and how the middle class began to erode, so to speak. And Maura, in your op-ed that you wrote that appeared in the Herald and the Times Argus, I think you touched upon this point a little bit, that the wealth gap between America's richest and poorest families have grown. And you mentioned how when you were growing up, there didn't seem to be that much difference between you and a lot of your friends and people you met. But now that seems to be a different picture. So I guess I just wondered, I'll throw this out to all of you. What are some of the reasons for how this bifurcation of wealth, this K-shaped sort of pattern emerged? I mean, was there some turning point moment that you look back on 30, 40, 50 years ago and say, aha, that's because we went this way instead of that way, that's how come we wound up now? Or was this a sort of an accumulation of many events and circumstances that no one could have controlled or foreseen that kind of brought us to this point?
Yeah, you've heard the cliche about for hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Well, my husband says I'm the Kevin Bacon 6 degrees of separation game, but I do it with housing, and I can be at any cocktail party and turn every conversation back to housing in any way. So I'm going to start off with a housing connection and say that I think that we can look at our housing markets and we can see where the divergence really took root. And I'm going to go back to the greatest home appreciation, land value appreciation in this country was in the latter half of the last century. And it was wonderful because after the post-World War experience led to the GI Bill, and so many people were able to access homeownership who had previously not had that opportunity. And think about how we feel now when 72% of Vermonters own their home. So for 72% of us, when we read the newspaper and we read that prices are skyrocketing and that they're at higher levels than before, and there's a 20% increase in home prices over the past year, we can be very concerned about our fellow Vermonters and the affordability that means. We also can think a little bit about what does that mean for myself? Wait a minute. did my home just go up by 20%? Hold on a second. Am I now sitting on a bigger piggy bank than I was sitting on a year ago? And there is a perversion of the markets here when we also benefit from these kind of escalations in value. I didn't do anything to my house over the past year to improve it, yet its value grew. And so when there are people who can appreciate that kind of, in my op-ed, I spoke about the passive income. It's what we know, that the super rich folks have stocks and bonds that earn them money while they're on the beaches of wherever. But homeownership is the way that most of us can tap into that passive income, and we can earn some equity by making regular mortgage payments, by having some home price appreciation. But when there's people who have been left out of that golden ticket, then they have a harder and harder time gaining access to that tool. And so if we go back to the 50s and 60s and 70s, when we saw home prices really take off and kind of unprecedented wealth building of the middle class, who wasn't a part of that? It was people who did not have access to homeownership. And in large part, that was people of color and Blacks who were denied that access. And there were others who could not. When you can't save up enough money to gain that entry point into homeownership, you are then left behind every time there's advancements. So that is one example of how housing plays into this, but I know that there's many others of ways and reasons why we got into this place.
I think that's so true, Maura. And I think for us, the big question is, what is the key to helping people out of poverty? And, in our country, we have the myth of Horatio Alger was sort of the 18th, 19th century myth that you'd pick yourself up by your bootstraps, and that every man, every woman is a yeoman and, can work hard and make progress. But we see intergenerational poverty where we see impediments. And the biggest difference between people who move into the middle class and people who don't is equity. It's that they have, when you're renting a house and you're living on a margin, all that money that you're paying in rent is just gone. And when you own, you're building that bank account, as Maura describes it. You're participating and you're growing your resources. And that's what middle class people do. It's like the game of life. You go around the board and you've got a house, and every time you go around the board, you're better off because your money is going into your bank. And that was sort of the whole middle class American dream that for many people, they don't see it as accessible anymore. So when we think about this proposition, we're saying that we need to look really systemically at what we do to help people get the dollars to get mortgages, how we look at the way we spend housing dollars, public resources, that can help people actually build their own equity over time. And how do we spur educational opportunities? And the other issues that Dan mentioned and Maura have mentioned about childcare and other facilities that give people the opportunity to get out in the workforce and be successful. So it's how do we help people who are going to lead their own way forward, rather than surround them with systems that essentially protect them but in place.
It is funny to be talking about this, the idea of closing economic disparity as a standalone proposition, because, Paul, so many of the other propositions, frankly, play into the idea of economic economic equity in Vermont, the childcare being one of them, broadband being another, housing. I do think, the thing to bear in mind about the housing and the sense of economic opportunity is that it's not static. The other important data point that I've seen in Vermont is that we have negative net migration among 18 to 44-year-olds. So you've got young families that would be moving into the middle class and having kids and filling schools and doing all of those things, who, by virtue of the cost of acquiring a home or finding a job that allows them to take the next step in terms of their professional career, are leaving. And there was an incredible article in 7 Days right before the pandemic so I think it was January of 2020. There was a report on the Bhutanese refugee community here in Chittenden County, and the outmigration of the Bhutanese community, people moving to, I think it was Cleveland in the Midwest. And they were looking for a sort of ethnic solidarity and a community that surrounded them. But one of the other factors that was front of mind for people leaving was the cost of home ownership. And the sort of barriers to being able to own a home and use that as a lever point for the economic security that they want to be able to provide for their families. And that's, we as a state have been getting these signals, from the perspective of people who would rise and populate the middle class, populate the workforce. The workforce for 20 years has been a substantial drag on the economic trajectory of a lot of Vermont employers. We've been getting these signals for more than 20 years, and I think we're overdue for a conversation around the systems that have created incentives. No matter how much somebody may love Vermont, they've created incentives for people to pursue a future elsewhere in terms of likelihood that they'll be able to provide for their kids in some different, more meaningful ways.
Well, let's just pivot for a second to thinking about how we might be able to rebalance the economic picture amongst various income groups. I mean, the typical approach, I guess, is to talk about the tax structure, right? Somehow or another, we need to get more money to build more affordable housing, let's say. And the best way to do that is to tax corporations or the wealthier, more affluent folks among us at a higher level to generate more money so the government can put some money into affordable housing or boosting broadband or increasing childcare opportunities, building better schools, all of that. That seems on one level a bit of a simplistic answer, and I know it's one that's also been rebutted frequently, but I guess I just wondered if you thought that would be one route that needs to be considered.
I'll jump on this one because it's always a hot potato, and I'm not an expert in tax policy, nor do I spend a lot of time in the legislature at this point. So what I would say is that when it comes to the migration in and out of Vermont of people of means, we do not see taxes necessarily as a disincentive for people to move here. So we do see people we do see in-migration of older folks who are more successful in their careers, who can afford homes in the kinds of places they want to retire to. We also see out-migration of professionals in their working careers and then retirees, but it's generally net neutral according to the Public Assets Institute. What I think the more important question, frankly, is and one that's incumbent upon the leadership of the state and legislature and organizations like all of ours to sort of call out long-term strategy that is going to actually make headway on the circumstances that drive economic, racial, and other disparities in the state. And that is, how is it that we're so out of balance in terms of the cost of home ownership, if that's a key pillar for economic equity? How is it that we're so out of balance in terms of the cost of post-secondary education, if that's a key pillar for economic equity and security and potential? How is it that we're out of balance in terms of the number of small businesses created in rural communities with a digital footprint, which is a key pillar of coming out of a recession for those, and a key point of economic security in those places? How is it that so many farms, if we're so reliant on our rural working landscape to drive the economic experience of those communities, how is it that so many farms are on the ropes? And so we need to be really, frankly, disciplined and committed to the investments that will actually change those courses, that change those conditions, change the systems that are holding those conditions in place. And that, every bit as important as raising new revenue as being committed to the long term. And that's why I think this VCRD discussion is so important, right? What are the things that are going to change the direction of Vermont demographically, the direction of Vermont racially, the direction of Vermont communities economically? What are those things that we need to be committed to over the course of years, not over the course of one legislative session, but over the course of the next decade? And I think that's a really important one, and one that the state has, we collectively have not been particularly good at.
Yeah, and it's frustrating to me when I see the inevitability my day job takes me down these rabbit holes of having to read reports by rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch. We're a financing agency, so these are important things to us. And there have been so many reports about Burlington, the state of Vermont, and other cities with high-priced home prices. And it continually, they speak to how home prices, for example, and affordability in general can suppress the economic vibrancy of communities. And in Vermont, we know that a couple years ago, the state had a downgrade in its ratings, and it was for two main reasons. One was a pension concern that we have, and then the other was our state's demographics. And so much conversation has gone to the pension problem, and we have clearly not fixed or resolved that. But I have to say that it's frustrating when we can wrap our arms around the pension conversation, so we put all of our focus on that topic, and we sort of feel like our demographic limitations are inevitable. Well, yeah, we're old, and a lot of us are white, and this is the way it is, and there's nothing you can do. I'm not saying it's not harder, because you have to pull so many threads to get to why are our demographics the way they are and what could change them. But it doesn't make it any less worthy having those conversations and looking for the policy tools, the investments that can change our demographics and change that future. It's multi-pronged, and it's going to take all of us, and therefore you can't just have a housing person trying to fix it. You have to have more things like the Community Foundation, which has, obviously, listening to Dan, you can tell like their fingers in all these conversations. VCRD is a listening organization, making sure that we have that feedback loop to know of what investments and policies are working and what's not. But I really think that it goes back to those demographics and those harder sticky widget problems that we need to have the courage to talk about and to address, and not some of the easier ones. I can't believe I just called the state's pension crisis an easy problem, so I'd like to pull that one back. You know what I mean about when you can identify a singular issue, it somehow feels easier, and demographics is much more amorphous.
Yeah.
Well, there are definitely things that you can do about the demographics, and there are definitely things that we should be considering and evaluating when we look at tax policy. The state is perennially looking at tax policy. I think that we're coming out of the most significant crisis of the last generation in terms of what people have gone through this last year and the potential upheaval. And you can see from the federal resources that are coming to Vermont right now that there's enormous opportunities for major change in Vermont. But it's not just about federal money. It's also about how we use this inflection point, how we come out of the crucible of the COVID crisis that we've gone through to look at how we renew our communities and what our core priorities are. And that's why we're leading this initiative. But part of that is saying, this is like 1932. We need to think of this as big a deal as the time when the GI Bill was put together. And legislators and the administration are doing some amazing work right now at looking at the strategic long-term investments that can help drive Vermont forward around all these issues, from housing to racial equity to broadband. And that's an incredible opportunity, one that we can't waste. But while we're doing it, we also have to look at the fact that historically, the highest income brackets are way lower taxed than they have been in previous periods. When we've done great things, we've taxed people to do them. And we have a set of assumptions that we can't change, or that everything's always incremental change. But when you look at patterns of history, there are points of punctuation. And part of our message is, let's choose to make this a point of punctuation. Let's not accept economic doldrums on the periphery. Let's be aggressive, and let's be clear, and come to as bold a consensus for positive action that can unite Republicans and Democrats. Republicans recognize these issues too, and we have the opportunity to think at large about things like long-term tax policy right now, and this is the time to do it.
as a former school teacher, I tend to always think of the education process as the pathway that makes the most sense to, sort of solve a lot of these problems. And Dan, last night I was browsing through your foundation's website, and you folks seem to stress the educational issue a fair amount, and part of it, you want to identify and eliminate barriers to post-secondary access and success for low-income and first-generation youth and adults. And I guess I just wondered, how could we go about doing that? What are ways that we can kind of eliminate those barriers? And given the fact also that a surprising percentage of Vermont's high school graduates don't go on to something after high school. A fact that always amazes me. Very high graduation rate from high school, but not a very high one, at least on a national level, when it comes to post-high school graduate education.
Well, I'm chuckling, Andrew, because I've been longing for somebody to ask me that question. No, my prior job before I came to the Community Foundation was as president of Vermont Technical College. So I have some incredibly strong feelings about the ways in which the state has made it just substantially more difficult for those young Vermonters who are most likely to benefit from taking that next step to actually do so. Now, and so it's hard for me to know where to start. The Community Foundation, and I'll separate my comments from the tactics of the Community Foundation has taken, because they are in alignment. But I want to be really clear. Vermont is just among the access institutions. Now, let me start with the national data. Nationally, higher education, the rate of tuition increases, the cost of higher education has gone up astronomically over the course of the last 30 years. That's a national trend. The rates of student loan debt, the amount of student loan debt, more than $1 trillion. I would actually call out that as another one of the pivot points that Maura had identified around housing, the point at which that trajectory took off. So it's a national trend around the cost of higher education. Now you overlay in Vermont that the colleges where low-income Vermonters would enroll at scale are simply more expensive than they are in every other state. And you've created college continuation nationally is also correlated to family income. So if you're a high family income, you're likely to go into college. If you're low family income, you're not likely to go into college. In Vermont, the institutions where low-income families aren't likely to enroll, the Community College of Vermont, Vermont Technical College, and the Vermont State Colleges, are substantially more expensive by virtue of the state's lack of investment in those institutions. Now, there are some things that the system could do differently in terms of structure, organization, and they're looking at a lot of those things. But the fact is, we've made it simply more expensive for young people who are connected to place by virtue of family circumstance to take that next step. The same technical degrees that Vermont Tech offers for $17,000 or $18,000 a year in the upper Midwest would be about $7,000 a year. And if you lived in Tennessee, they would be free. And so the Community Foundation, so we just made the system more expensive as a pathway to economic opportunity. And we bear the demographic, social, civic, and economic consequences of that constantly. Every time an employer raises the issue about accessing, finding workforce, every time we wonder why young people are leaving, we're bearing those consequences constantly. The cost of higher education is inextricably connected to our demographic situation. And so, put that aside. The Community Foundation's progress and look at this has been led by the J. Warren and Lois McClure Foundation, which is part of this. And about 10 years ago, they started a deep dive in this work. And they've done research along with the State Department of Labor, identifying pathways to high growth, high wage careers that exist in Vermont. Really, what do you need to study to be able to access the jobs that exist here that pay more than $21 an hour? And they come out with that report every 2 years and really chart the course for young people who are looking for the education that's going to lead to a wage that allows them to be here. A year ago, in the middle of the pandemic, an incredibly inspiring gift, the J. Warren and Lois McClure Foundation came forward and said, every kid coming out of the Vermont high schools in 2020 gets a free course at the Community College of Vermont. Community College of Vermont was one of the only community colleges in the country whose enrollment didn't go down last year, particularly among young high school graduates. And so wouldn't you know it, the data now tells us we've got at least 1 year's worth of good data that says if Vermont colleges are 20% more affordable, more young people will continue their education and be connected to the skills and knowledge that allow them to compete in the 21st century. So I think I don't want to talk too long. I don't want to suck all the oxygen out of the conversation, but one of the things about the proposition work that I think is so inspiring is that it calls out, it calls out some really clear steps. It calls out some really clear calls to action around how you change how you rebuild the steps to economic security and economic potential and prosperity in Vermont communities. And it calls on people to actually be committed to that over time. So some of these are not complex problems to solve. Public college affordability in Vermont is not a particularly complex problem to solve. It's a financial problem and it requires discipline. Similarly, I do think the die is cast for young people when they start in the kindergarten, right? Middle to high income families have hundreds, if not thousands of more hours spent in certain activities that put their kids on a different trajectory than kids born into poverty or more challenging circumstances. Kids born into poverty or more challenging circumstances are dealing with the adverse childhood experiences that make learning more complex over the course of their K-12 experience. So, there's systemic investments and commitments that, oh, by the way, would also unlock that economic potential of middle-class Vermonters and keep more people rooted here if we're willing to be disciplined about them. And I apologize for getting up on that high horse for a bit.
No, I couldn't agree more, Dan. And I think that it speaks to this interdependence that the Vermont proposition builds on, because when you talk about how higher ed could be more affordable, that would directly impact the affordability of Vermont overall. We know that the homeownership rate of younger households has dropped 9% nationally. I'm looking for the Vermont numbers. I don't have them in front of me, but of that drop in the homeownership rate, the national research shows that 20% of that is directly attributed to the higher student loan debt that people are carrying. And I've had some tough conversations with critics who say, well, that happens. So they have to postpone homeownership so that maybe someone used to be a first-time home buyer in their late 20s, then it moved to be their mid 30s. Now maybe they're in their early to mid 40s when they buy their first home. It's been postponed, but it has not been eliminated altogether. So isn't it okay? To which I want to take that long view and look at our state overall and say, okay, but a lot of us do go the route of the 30-year mortgage. And so if you enter into homeownership in your late 20s and you add on 30 years of paying for that mortgage, then by the time you're facing retirement, it looks a lot more stable, safe, and secure, because one of your biggest costs for your household, your home, is probably paid down to a point or off, ideally. But if you don't make that leap into homeownership until your 40s, and then you look 30 years down the road, now we know why people feel stuck where they have to work a full-time job well into their 70s that they may not have the ability or desire to do. And that causes a crunch for us as well. So the ripple effects of these educational investment choices that we make, and I'm glad you brought it back to the preschool and early childhood education. I know Dan and I are both parents of younger children. And so, we're living it ourselves of needing to cover these costs and do these things. And so many Vermonters, I think, have had that, again, that focus during this pandemic where fewer people were able to juggle this when we saw what happened when the early childhood care went away. And so then it did start to impact everyone, and not just those who are used to juggling these things, but then, it kind of impacted all of us, and we see the importance of it. And the whole idea of an essential worker got redefined for all of us when we saw that these are the essential workers that keep the entire economy going, which is why we can't leave anyone behind in this effort.
Yeah, and I would jump on that too. These are the people who are on the front lines of the pandemic, people who work in restaurants, people who work in healthcare, people who work in banks, people who continued one way and another to adjust and to try to manage, and whose incomes were often diminished, and whose really were challenged on the front line of the pandemic. While, people who had money in stocks, it was kind of a miracle, but with the federal leadership, people who are doing quite well continue to do quite well. And that's just sort of a fundamental contradiction of what we've been through. While we had more people waiting in line for food than any time probably since the Depression in this country, other folks were doing very well. And it sort of typifies the challenge that we have, where is that really acceptable for the long term? Is that really the direction we want to go as a democracy? One of the things that Maura's pointing to when you think about home ownership, and let's face it, we do a lot to invest in homes for low income people, and it's really crucial that we do, and that we have the strong safety net in Vermont that we have. But we do have contradictions there. We have benefit cliffs that where you, as a young family or a family that's living low income, as you begin to make progress economically with work, you may lose benefits that make it actually not in the interest of your family to continue to make more money. And there's a huge gap between that where you're actually negatively impacted and you're losing benefits rather than actually building sort of profit as you move forward. And then we invest a lot of dollars in affordable housing, and we need to, and it's been incredibly vital for our communities. But when we do, we haven't been investing in ways that let people step out of poverty or have an opportunity as directly for home ownership most often. And that's the key, is that a lot of people are in a situation where it doesn't matter how hard they work, and it doesn't matter, they don't make enough of a profit over their expenses to be able to save, and they're putting money into a home that doesn't build that equity for them. So it's like there's this big dividing line, and that's something that seems really fundamental to come back to in Vermont. How do we actually help people step out of poverty rather than be secure in poverty?
Maura, I want to take advantage of the fact we have you on the panel and a housing expert here who clearly knows way more about housing and finance than I do. But one thing that's always puzzled me, has for the last several years, is clearly the market is screaming that there's a need for more affordable or workforce housing. I hear that all the time, certainly down here at this end of the state, and I'm sure it's the case across Vermont.
There's two questions I get asked most often. One is, what is affordable housing anyway? And the other one is, and why is it so expensive to make housing, especially in Vermont? And so, you spoke to, Levittown, and when we used to put up tons of housing. And so we were adding to the state's and the community's housing stock, the homes in our community. The rate at which we are now adding homes to Vermont's housing stock has dropped by almost 100% of what we were doing just in the 1980s. And the 1980s was far less than what we were doing in the 50s and 60s that you were referencing. So first off, you're not wrong that we just aren't adding more homes. And there's a bunch of reasons why. One is that back at that point, there was much more direct federal investment to support the starter homes being constructed, and we don't have that now. Also, communities I know it's going to shock you to hear this. Communities used to want housing. They used to have this idea that they wanted their communities to grow, to attract residents, to have more opportunities for employers to have their workforce close by. And that dynamic has changed over the last several decades. And it used to be that a municipality would actually put in roads, put in sewers, put in sidewalks, and then the developer only had to do the housing construction in a neighborhood. That made it more affordable because the municipality was picking up the tab for the recreation path and the sidewalks and the lights and the roads. That's no longer the case. Now, when we put in a new housing development, we not only have that homeowner pay for the cost of their home, but also all the infrastructure that goes with it. And another thing, you said, Levittown and such wasn't pretty, but we got it done. We've lost the willingness to have it not be pretty. We have this idea of what housing should look like, and we want our communities to look that way. I know in my hometown that is at a railroad junction, and the railroad passes through multiple times a day, and I was at a local development committee meeting, and we were talking about redevelopment around the railroad tracks, and what was being proposed was what I would describe, and in fact, I believe someone actually used this phrase, like a quaint New England village, and someone referenced Cape Cod or Martha's Vineyard. Well, we were at the crossroads of a railroad intersection. There was no whales in the distance or lighthouses on the horizon. And it just is striking to me that people, I was at that meeting because they want to talk about affordable housing. So they listened to me drone on for probably a good 20 minutes about how much affordable housing we need. And they all nodded their heads. Yes, we need more affordable housing. We need it. What can we do? We'll do anything. And then the conversation shifted to this new development that was being proposed. And I heard them asking the developer, could you upgrade the siding though to that nicer kind, because we don't want the vinyl clad here, and could you put in a rec path as well as a sidewalk and as well as everything else, because we really want this all to be here. And every time we make those decisions, I'm not saying if they're wrong, this is my neighborhood that I'm talking about, my neighbors. I don't want anything ugly and slapdash to be put up, but we do keep having housing have to bear the cost of all the things we want. And then we keep saying, why is it the developer's fault that they can't get this done cheaper? But we want that developer to have net zero energy housing. We want there to be solar panels. We want it to be very energy efficient. We want, yes, to support, pay in the impact fees for our recreation department or all these extra things. And then we can't figure out why we've added to the cost of housing. And it all, in many ways, we've studied this enough times, and it's one of these, again, I'm a parent, so it's a little frustrating because I'm like, I keep saying the same answer. People don't want to hear it. It a lot of times goes back to density. If 20% of a home's price is the lot cost, the land costs, then if you can put a few more homes on that plot of land, you are by definition going to make the housing so much more affordable. But we don't like that. We still have large acre zoning in much of Vermont. And that's very appropriate when you don't have jobs nearby, services nearby. I'm not looking to pave all of Vermont and to run sewer lines into agricultural areas and places where we don't want to see development. But where you do have, I don't know, an Amtrak station nearby, a lot, maybe our state's second largest employer, you can guess what community I'm talking about. I think these are the downtown infill places that we should be concentrating our development, so that we can then protect the rest of the more rural countryside. And so density is not a bad thing. I wrote an opinion piece to my local paper a few years ago, and I'd like to think I didn't lose friends over it, but I definitely, people remind me of it because the headline was, I want more. And it talked about, I want, people were very concerned about all the development that was happening, and we're going to become Winooski, as if that was a bad thing, and the veiled racism that I hear with that. And so I had to respond and say, I want more traffic, because the more traffic there is, it means the more people are going to put their car away and start walking. I want more crossing guards. I want more students of diverse backgrounds in school with my kids. I want more jobs. I want more restaurants I can go to. I want more of all of it, because it's through that more that I think that our communities become richer, become more dense and more vibrant. And those are the kind of communities that I want to connect with and be a part of.
Yes, to everything you're saying, Maura. We are out there at the end of dirt roads in communities all the time who are desperate to attract young families. They mostly know they have to expand housing. And another piece of this is the infrastructure that they need to be able to build housing in their communities. But we have to look at the regulatory side to this too. We need to say, how do we encourage housing where we want it versus just where we don't want it, regulate it where we don't want it. And there's lots of stories of how challenging it has been and how that raises the costs. We also need to think about the density and the size of houses and the condoization of some housing project in our village centers, so that there's a diversity of housing for people with different incomes, but also gives them an opportunity to get a start in home ownership. So I'll just say thank you, Andrew, and give Dan the chance to share his last observation.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Paul, and Maura. Thank you for that last set of commentary on wanting more. And I would go a step further. I think the state needs more. Right? We can't continue to be a state of 626,000 people, and so if we have to grow, then we have to think about what it means for us to grow, how, where, when we want it, and it needs to be housing in downtown. It needs to be dense, and if we're lucky enough and fortunate enough to lay the foundation for doing so. Our growth needs to be in ways that are more diverse and supporting an evolving sense of who is a Vermonter and what it means to belong in Vermont. We need to create a set of circumstances that allow people of all backgrounds, all races, and all personal histories to succeed and thrive in our place, in our state, in ways that I don't think we've done effectively over the course of the last 30 years. We've got to wrestle with this over the course of the next 3, over the course of the next 5, over the course of the next 10. To get it right over the course of the next 30 years. And we can't be satisfied coming out of this pandemic, coming out of this circumstance, this set of circumstances we're in, to get back to where we were. Because where we were was a set of communities that were in steady, slow, but functional decline in terms of age, demographics, workforce, economics. And that's a scary place. And that's a non-functional place for us to be in the long term. And I think you've heard, talking about just this fourth of the Vermont proposition parts, you've really heard a plug for almost all 10 of them, and because it sets a foundation for a Vermont that is growing and thriving and offers a sense of connection and lays a pathway to a much stronger civic, social, and economic backbone than we have currently right now, or we have had over the course of the last decade. So thank you all for participating and inviting me into this and letting me get on my high horse about higher education. But all the other pieces that fit into the pathways to reducing economic disparity and closing the opportunity gap.
Well, thank all of you for being with us today. Boy, I wish we had another hour to continue this conversation. Really getting into some fascinating stuff here, but I guess we'll have to leave it there for today. But want to thank Maura Collins of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, Dan Smith of the Vermont Community Foundation, and Paul Costello of the Vermont Council on Rural Development for sharing their thinking on this fourth proposition. Next week, we'll be discussing Proposition 5. Vermont must relocalize energy, agriculture, and business investment for a resilient economy. So I hope you'll all have a chance to tune in for that as well. Thanks again for being with us today. Thank you to our panel. We'll see you next week.